Unidentified African-American soldier in Union uniform with his wife and 2 daughters, 1863 to 1865. On February 23, 1885, Englishman John Lee, sentenced to death, ascended the gallows 3 times, and 3 times the trapdoor below him, into which the condemned man was to fall, failed to open. The first time, Lee stood on the lid for 6 minutes. 2 escorts kicked at it, trying to force it down. After a carpenter had shaved off the edges of the hatch and greased the hinges, the condemned man was led to his execution a second time. The hatch still wouldn't open. The commandant of the prison then personally inspected and tested the mechanism of the gallows for 20 minutes. It worked perfectly. But put on the gallows for the 3rd time, John Lee still did not fail. On the same day, his death sentence was commuted to life imprisonment. Until 1907, John Lee was in prison, then was pardoned and went to the United States, where he died in 1933. Legendary magician Harry Houdini before performing his famous escape from the cell, 1899. The 1902 eruption of the Montagne Pelée volcano was the worst volcanic disaster of the 20th century. In less than a minute, the volcano destroyed the entire town of Saint-Pierre, located at its foot. It is the largest city on the island of Martinique. A month before the eruption, the volcano was smoking and releasing fumes, but locals quickly got used to it. Most were sure there was nothing to worry about, as it had happened before. But some, especially the cautious ones, left their homes, leaving everything they had gained. The newspapers also assured the inhabitants that it was not dangerous to stay in the city, and thousands of people believed them to their peril. On May 8th, the townspeople were celebrating the feast of the Ascension of Christ to heaven when suddenly 3 clouds consisting of atomized lava, vapors and gases burst out of the volcano and covered the town. Their temperature was over 1,000 degrees Celsius. In less than a minute, the entire city was destroyed. Of the estimated 30,000 residents who were still in the city, only 3 survived. A 10-year-old girl named Avivra Dar Ifral was on a boat and managed to escape by hiding in one of the coastal caves. Leon Compa Leandre, who lived on the outskirts of the city, jumped into the boiling ocean and escaped with multiple burns. The criminal Louis Auguste Saparas was in solitary confinement in the basement during the eruption, which turned out to be the only safe place in the city. There were more residents who escaped, but they died of their burns. Some people died instantly before they even realized what had happened to them, and judging by their calm faces, they didn't even feel pain. Others, on the contrary, felt their blood boiling in their veins and their lungs filling with red-hot gases. They tried to escape, but the fiery wave that overtook them made them scream in agony and squirm in terrible pain. Their agony remained on their faces. Pictured, the bodies of 15 residents lying on a destroyed street, huddled together as they died, and a rescue worker who sits next to the corpses of a family who died instantly in their room. The city of Saint-Pierre before and after. If it weren't for care, it wouldn't be the same job. Women pulling a raft upstream. Photo by Vinogradov ZZ, 1910 to 1913. Grand Duchesses Olga and Anastasia pulling a peasant boy out of a pit, 1915, Mogilev. A steam locomotive moves along a flooded street during a flood in Boston, 1915. Arrival of troops of the Russian Expeditionary Corps in Marseille, 1916. The Expeditionary Corps of the Russian Imperial Army participated in World War I in France and Greece at the initiative of the 2 states as part of international aid and exchange between the 2 Entente allies. The RIA Special Expeditionary Force consisted of 4 separate special infantry brigades, 2 regiments each totaling 750 officers and 45,000 non-commissioned officers and soldiers, which arrived in France during 1916. Policewoman, USA, 1918. Leola N. King, America's first woman regulator. A British Army officer traveling in a hammock with a sunshade. Sierra Leone, 1920. Collector of golf balls, 1920s. Street barbershop in Moscow, 1921. Salon of a Rolls-Royce automobile, 1926. Loading passengers onto an airship from a mooring mast at Cardington, England, 1929. A class pyramid created for the historical and patriotic pantomime Moscow is burning at the Moscow Circus based on Vladimir Mayakovsky's book of the same name, USSR, 1930. Female students at a physical education lesson at an Anglo-Scandinavian summer camp, 1935. Olympics in Nazi Germany, 1936. This is how the madness begins. Children cooling off in a kindergarten courtyard on a hot day, New York City. The picture was taken in 1941. In an Orthodox church, Moscow, August 1941. Kodak K24 camera for aerial photography during World War II, 1943. Crossing the Dnieper River on improvised means in September 1943. Dry ration distribution in the U.S. Army in the Ardennes, 1944. 1945. A British medical sergeant is pictured disinfecting former prisoners of the Bergen-Belsen concentration camp. Sophia Loren, 1950s. Korean refugees cross a bridge damaged in an airstrike. The crossing is said to have taken place in complete silence. Korean War, 1950. Employees of Ellie's research laboratory testing a construction helmet by throwing a steel ball at it, 1957. Ship traffic on the Volga River in the 1960s. The fall of a grandstand during the Indianapolis 500 in 1960. The homemade 30-meter grandstand was built by a private citizen as a scaffolding for watching the race and was popular with spectators for many years. For the modest sum of $5 minus $10, one could see the race from above in all its glory. During the race in 1960, there were 120 to 130 people in the grandstand. As the cars approached, people began to move to the edge, leaning forward to get a better view of the race participants. As a result, the structure lost stability and collapsed on the people standing under it. 2 people died, 80 were injured, 22 of them very seriously. A 1960 British machine that poured whiskey. Chinese Marshal Peng Dehuai is led by Hon Weibin to a public humiliation ceremony as a counter-revolutionary during the Cultural Revolution. Beijing, 1966. Peng Dehuai was a Chinese revolutionary and Minister of Defense of the People's Republic of China from 1954 to 1959. Marshal of the PRC. He came into conflict with Mao Zedong because he did not approve of the cult of personality and opposed the politicization of the army. He was accused of creating an anti-party clique of right-wing opportunists, was deprived of all posts, ranks and titles. He spent 6 years under house arrest in Wujia, returned his uniform and orders to the state. In 1965, at the suggestion of the heads of the party wing of the pragmatists Liu Shaoqi and Deng Xiaoping, returned to the government and appointed to oversee military construction in southwest China. He sent an 80,000-character letter to Mao Zedong describing his service to the people and the party and demanding rehabilitation, but was rejected. During the Cultural Revolution, he was whipped by the Hon Weibin on the direct orders of Jiang Qing and Lin Biao. Between 1966 and 1970, he was repeatedly publicly subjected to criticism and self-criticism as well as humiliation and torture. In 1970, formally convicted by a military tribunal as an enemy of Mao Zedong and the Communist Party and sentenced to life imprisonment. In 1973, he was transferred to a prison hospital, where he died from lack of care and pain medication. He was posthumously rehabilitated in 1978 at the 3rd plenum of the CPC Central Committee. Of the 11th CPC Central Committee. Saint-Brieuc, France, 1972. Photographer Jacques Jourmelin of the newspaper West France took this photo when workers at the Joint Francais factory demonstrated. The workers were paid 1,000 francs for a 48-hour work week and were on strike to get a 70 centimes an hour wage increase. In addition to the police, the demonstrators were met by a detachment of the CRS Republican security squads. In this confrontation, Guy Bourmieux, a worker, and Jean-Yvon Antignac, a policeman, came face to face. Guy recognized his old childhood friend and classmate. In tears of rage, he grabbed the policeman by the collar and shouted, "Come on, hit me if you're with them." However, Gina Von remained calm during this scene as he was simply doing his job. After this demonstration, an emotional guy changed jobs and re-established his friendship with Gina Von, meeting his friend regularly at the pub. Guy even trained Gina Von's son at the factory. Drilling a hole in a concrete wall, Lithuania, 1973. Photographers are known as Bulgakov. Times when port wine Agdam was a ruble each. Port wine 777 3 axes was 2.47 rubles, and vodka white was 3.62 rubles. In the wine department of the Mitishchi Gastronome, USSR, 1979. Meeting between Kim Il-sung and János Kádár, General Secretary of the Hungarian Socialist Labour Party, 1984. Kim Il-sung was forbidden to be photographed from the right side in the last years of his life. The reason, as seen in the photo, is a tennis ball-sized tumor of unknown origin on his neck, which began to progress in the North Korean leader in his old age, and all photos of him were withdrawn from public access. Kim Il-sung's death is also shrouded in mystery. According to official data, he died of a heart attack on July 8, 1994, but some sources say that his death was the result of a failed attempt to operate on a growth on his neck. Kim Il-sung's real name was Kim Sung-ju, which means becoming a pillar in Korean. After the Russo-Japanese War of 1904-1905, Korea was annexed by Japan, and as a result, the Kim family had to move to Manchuria. There, as a teenager, Seong-ju joined an underground Marxist circle and later settled on the pseudonym Kim Il-sung, translated as Rising Sun. According to one version, the choice was made not by chance, but in honor of the famous Korean patriot who died at the hands of the Japanese. On September 27, 1986, an unusual show took place in Cleveland, USA, in which a local charitable foundation decided to simultaneously launch 1.5 million helium-infused balloons into the air. 2,500 volunteers worked on the main task of the spectacular show simultaneously. They worked for several hours filling balloons with helium, which accumulated under a giant net. The venue for the show, which was called Balloon Fest '86, was one of Cleveland's central squares, surrounded by the city's tallest buildings. It was rather cloudy and rainy that day in Cleveland. That is, the weather was not very good for setting such a record. So, at 13:30 local time, the net was removed and a cloud of 1.5 million balloons was released. The launch was a success and the spectacle was truly mesmerizing. The overcast sky of the city played with colors thanks to the beautiful balloons, which completely filled the sky. It looked like a rainbow burst into hundreds of thousands of balloons. The organizers already thought that their performance, which cost $500,000, was a complete success, but the worst was ahead. The thing is that because of the rain, the balloons rushed down and began to fall all over the neighborhood. The wind simply threw the balloons from the heights back down, scattering them all over the city. The air traffic was primarily the problem. The balloons made it impossible to see anything. The sky was filled with an impenetrable cloud. Some of the balloons blocked the runway of the local airport, and some fell on the roads, causing many accidents. Also, some balloons were blown south, where the balloons spooked an expensive racehorse, which was injured because of it. Her owner ended up suing a local charity for $100,000. Also worth noting is the damage the balloons caused to the environment. Local beaches were filled with rubber trash. The shore of Lake Ontario was also polluted. In addition, many of the balloons landed on Lake Erie, completely covering its surface and thus interfering with the work of rescuers who were just then searching for two missing fishermen who had disappeared the day before the balloons were launched into the sky. Because the rescuers could not fly in a sky filled with balloons, the fishermen could not be found. As members of that rescue team recall, they flew that day as if through an asteroid field. The bodies of the fishermen were not found until weeks later. Afterward, the wife of one of the deceased men filed a lawsuit against the Cleveland Foundation, demanding $3.2 million in compensation. Organizers from the charity failed to account for the weather, and more importantly, failed to realize that the balloons do not fly into space, but fall to Earth after they deflate or collide with a cold front and burst. Even though they technically set a world record, it wasn't worth the human and material sacrifice. All the money from the event ended up going to pay off lawsuits and created the headache of clearing the city of balloons. Clergyman at the presentation of the financial pyramid Kopyor Invest, 1994. Photo by Viktor Aklomov. Trading in the back of a car on a Moscow street, 1994. A father tries his best to help and comfort his child in a prisoner of war camp. 2003. In Najaf, Iraq.